Hello, everyone. This is Keith Mokris here at Orca Security, and welcome to today's webinar, CNAP, What to Know About Securing Cloud-Native Applications. We have a bunch of folks joining in now, and we're going to take roughly 30 seconds or so to let kind of a contingent of folks join, and then we'll be kicking off on time. So stay tuned for just a minute. Okay, thank you so much to everyone who joined on time for today's program. I'm really excited to be leading the discussion today about cloud-native application protection platforms and how organizations are approaching security when it comes to modern cloud-native applications. First and foremost, we're thrilled to be joined by Vivek Menon, VP and CISO at Digital Turbine. And Vivek, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to the audience, share a little bit about your background and your current focus at Digital Turbine.
Of course. Thank you, Keith. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. As Keith said, I'm the VP and CISO at Digital Turbine. If you folks don't know what DT or Digital Turbine does, we are a pretty important player in the mobile ad tech business, a public firm, where we support the underlying technology foundation between a publisher of an ad and a supplier of an ad. And all things in between. We are also native to about roughly, when I say native, I mean like a part of the firmware for roughly about 800 million devices, so mainly on Android, some on iOS as well. And so it's an exciting space to be in. I come to DT, or my remit at DT is all things information security as well as IT compliance. And I come to DT from JP Morgan Chase, where I was part of the cybersecurity leadership team. And before JP Morgan, I was at Capital One, again, part of the cybersecurity leadership team. And I'm super excited to have this conversation with Neil and Keith.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. We're also thrilled to be joined by Neil Carpenter, Principal Technical Evangelist here at Orca Security. And Neil, talk a little bit about your role as well as your background within the cloud-native ecosystem.
Sure. So this is probably the best job of my life. I get to spend a lot of time talking with our customers and our partners and everybody about security problems and how we help solve them and how they can get ahead of them. And I do a lot of speaking, a lot of writing, a lot of interacting with everybody in our orbit. My background, I spent a long time working on security incidents as an analyst, as a lead. I was at Microsoft. I did a lot of work on how we responded to incidents in Azure, Office 365, some of the early work on those platforms. Helped build out what is now called DART, which is the consulting team there around incident response. So I really saw how security goes off the rails, how things go wrong, and had an opportunity from there to spend about 5 years in the container and Kubernetes space, working out how security solutions help customers get ahead of those things. And now at Orca, I'm building on that in the cloud native space all the way across everything that people are doing.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to, be the instigator of the conversation today. And, to start, I want to start with you, Vivek, about Digital Turbine's specific journey to the cloud. You obviously described, a pretty amazing business. What role does the cloud play within that strategy?
Yeah, so for DT, even though it's sort of a cliched word to use, we have been cloud native from the get-go. And over the last 1 year, we have actually become a multi-cloud native, so to speak, where we have, migrating part of our workload and applications from one major cloud service provider to another. And it's the fulcrum of all things that we do. As you can imagine, like serving the ad tech business for all of our clients across the world, scalability is of utmost importance to us. And one of the key benefits of being cloud native is, being scalable and at a global level. So as we have built out our portfolio of products, there has never been a question of not being native to the cloud in terms of building out these products and services. What it has also done is that we have a whole host of individuals who are experts in their respective areas, not from a cloud point of view, or not just from a cloud point of view, but also how does advertisement technology work on the cloud, and how does it scale, how is it secure, how do we maintain all the privacy features that we are that we have to comply with, and so on. So that's the I would say the ecosystem, the cloud ecosystem that DT operates in. And as I mentioned, we were predominantly a AWS based customer, and then with our business expanding, as well as some of the needs from our clients as well, we have actually started to leverage GCP as well as our cloud service provider. But it's been interesting. All things cloud, we sort of knee deep into it.
Awesome. I think that's an amazing story, and just how broad and big and expansive, everything you're working on is. Neil, I'd love, some of your perspectives as well, as you've worked at, many different companies across the ecosystem. Obviously Vivek described, like a cloud native first focus. But how do you see some companies who are coming from a more traditional background getting into the cloud? What are some of the reasons they're trying to go cloud native that are top of mind for you?
Yeah, I think there's, first of all, right off the top, it's often a developer-led, a shadow IT move, if you will, if you're looking at traditional companies. It's really attractive to, I think, developers, operations teams, business owners, because of how quickly you can move. Because you can deploy something with a credit card in minutes instead of having to figure out how to move things into the data center, how to plug them up, how to connect them, how to work with them. And so, whether it's shadow IT or it's a more purposeful move, I think that's the first driver, is simply being able to move quickly, being able to be agile. And this is across all the businesses I talk to. This has been a change, I think, over the last 10 years, over the last 5 years, is people have come to realize everything is software. Whether I'm building something in a factory, I'm selling something in a store, I'm sort of delivering services, I'm cloud native from the get-go. Today, everything is running on software, and being able to move quickly, deliver quickly is an advantage. It allows you to solve problems, getting things to your customers, getting them in front of your customers. It allows you to implement new features and reach new customers. So for me, that's the big proposition, is being able to be quicker, move faster, scale better, scale up and down better. And so, that journey typically is going to start somewhere. It's going to start in a team. It's going to start in a business unit. They're going to have successes. And then I think we're going to we see it expand out across the company. At the same time, typically now we're 15 years or more into the cloud journey. Top down, the CXOs are looking at what is if we're not already there, what is our path? What is our pattern? And building on top of that, figuring out where does it make sense to move workloads into the cloud? Where does it make sense to build new in the cloud, and what that path looks like?
Yeah, Keith, I'll also add, like, cloud native, the definition itself has undergone some changes, or I would say has matured, so to speak. As I mentioned in my intro, I used to be part of Capital One, and Capital One was one of the first big banks to go all in with cloud, specifically AWS. And just running our workloads on EC2 was considered cloud native at that point, right? And things have matured in the cloud space, as Neil mentioned. Like, we are like year 15 into the journey. But as we got into the 2019, 2020s, the definition of what cloud native stood for has morphed into: are you using Kubernetes? Are you running serverless? Are you using containers? And so on. So in case of DT, all of that is true. And one of the prime reasons we went multi-cloud is to start leveraging Kubernetes to a far greater extent than we were doing. So just wanted to point that out, that the definition itself has matured.
I think that's a great point, because, I think back on Azure and the journey I took there. And, Azure started off as a .NET hosted sort of thing, and it didn't really take off until they added VMs to it. And then suddenly everybody was lifting and shifting whole machines from data centers into Azure, which worked great for some things, but it turned out that mostly that ends up being more expensive than running them in your data center. Where you realize all of those benefits is when you start tearing down a traditional application, breaking it up into microservices, deploying it in cloud native methodologies, and really taking advantage of what's unique about the cloud. So it's the definition has definitely changed. The approaches have changed. The thinking has changed as we've moved into it.
And I think, this really sets the stage for us to shift from, architecture and implementation to security. Because, with these new type of architectures, but also new approaches to deployments, security needs to evolve with it. So Vivek, I'll start with you. You described, the architectures that you're using. Obviously, there are a lot of different security requirements that any company would need to start thinking about. But how did you prioritize key functionality from the security side for you and the teams that you're responsible for? Where did you start?
Yeah, so before we even talk about prioritizing, I think we, as a CISO, have to talk about the constraints that come along with this role, right? So having worked for bigger banks where security and risk compliance was of utmost importance, having a big team and having the executive buy-in was almost a given, right? But now still working for a public firm, but albeit a small to medium-sized firm, where being compliant is not of the highest order in terms of priority. So it becomes I have to sort of juggle between what are our business needs, what commitment we can make from a financial metrics point of view, and what resources do I have. And I start with those constraints and then start my priority list, so to speak. But the number one thing that I look for is how critical is it for the business for a particular service, feature, or application to be functional 24/7, or what happens if it goes down, and so on. And a lot of that priorities have been identified and built in, and we have a list of applications that we call as our crown jewels. And so we start off with that in terms of how we want to protect them, how we want to build them, etc. The second layer that I bring in is there are SOX applications that also fall into the realm of important applications. There is overlap with some of the crown jewels that I previously mentioned, but then there are just pure SOX applications which have financial impact, not necessarily a business impact, but a financial impact, and that becomes priority number two. And third is what we gather from tools that we use in our ecosystem. There are lots of, I would say, world-class tools which point us to where some of our deficiencies lies, our biggest vulnerabilities, our biggest misconfigurations, our biggest security misses, so to speak. And we factor that in as well as point number three from a prioritization point of view. And so once we combine these constraints and the priority list that we have, that sort of gives us the 1, 2, 3, 4 that we have to attack in a very methodical manner. But that's the process that we follow at TT.
Awesome. And Neil, again, you have a perspective working with lots of different organizations. What are some of the anchor points or starting blocks that you see them, benefiting from if they do it the right way?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting space because the security challenges haven't changed as I've moved from on-prem to cloud-based in a large way, right? I'm worried about confidentiality, integrity, availability. I'm worried about attackers compromising something, building a beachhead, moving laterally, getting access to things, taking action. What has changed is how I identify and address those problems. And I often talk about vulnerability management as an example, right? If I have a vulnerability on 5 VMs, it's pretty easy. Somebody from operations comes along at 2 a.m., patches those VMs, closes the ticket, and I'm good to go. If I have the same vulnerability in a bunch of container applications running on Kubernetes, the problem is no different. If it's a remote code execution vulnerability, I have the same concerns, basically. But finding it is different because I have to take a different approach to vulnerability assessment. Fixing it is different because I can't patch running VMs and reboot them and be okay. I've got to go back to the development team who built that image, fix it in the image, rebuild the image, reship the image, retest the image, all of that stuff. So pulling it full circle back around to your question, I think, some of the things that first where I see people starting is with vulnerability management, with what they've deployed in the cloud. It's a problem that they're already familiar with. It's a problem that is top of mind every day. It's a problem that a lot of investment has gone into. I think visibility is the second one, especially as you move into self-service architecture. When everything was in the data center, it's super easy to know what's deployed because you've got asset tags, and to deploy something new, somebody's got to drag something out of a box and put it in a rack. That's no longer the case. Now I can write code that deploys things for me as I need. And it becomes a very, very difficult problem to solve. How do I know everything that's deployed? How do I know everything that's out there and how it's configured? Configuration management's the third big one. A lot of the compromises we see hit the news from the cloud are around configuration. They're a S3 bucket that was misconfigured and allowed public access, I think is far and away the most common thing we see in the news. So from a security perspective, how do I get eyes on those configuration problems and address them and prioritize them? I think the fourth big one is data. We're moving as much data to the cloud as we are applications, as we are processes. So how do I line up? How do I understand where that data is being stored, how it's being protected, how it's being used, and where it's been copied to? One of the other big stories we see is, oh, we accidentally had production data in a test database, or similar sorts of. We made a copy of it for testing, and then nobody properly secured the copy. So those sorts of things. Now, that's one dimension of problem. The other dimension of problem, I think, is how do I get ahead of them? So typically, organizations are going to start with the real-time view of what's deployed, what's out there, what's running, what's in production today. I think if that's all you do, it becomes madness because things are moving so quickly. Security teams can never keep up with that. You're just going to be generating alert after alert after alert, problem after problem after problem. So as we mature and as teams get deeper into this and really get ahead of the problems, I'm seeing these approaches move. We call it shifting left, but really moving to how do I catch problems before they're in production, before they're in the world? How do I start looking at the infrastructure as code that we're writing to deploy things in the cloud, to apply my security policies there, make sure we're not deploying problems? How do I look at the work the developers are doing to deploy to make sure we catch the easy things early, fix them? And that way my security teams can focus on emergent problems, critical risks, the sorts of things that we're more concerned about, and you make better use of limited groups of people.
And Vivek, I can see you're, leaning in. Anything, to add to what Neil described there from, real
Yeah,
world scenarios?
lots of agreement in the way he described the 1, 2, 3, 4. Vulnerability management is certainly an area of focus for us. We have a dedicated vulnerability and patch management program, and we certainly leverage Orca, but there are other tools as well that we use to complement some of the things that we do there. Specifically in our case, data is not too much. Data security posture management is not of critical importance. It's high importance but not critical, mainly because we don't store any data that is considered PII. So it's doesn't get us off the hook from any potential data breaches, so to speak. But the level of risk associated with the breach and the outcomes for that, or the adverse outcomes from that, is limited for us.
So I would actually say, I would say it is critical, but you've approached it from a policy perspective to make sure it's easier to manage.
Right, from a not collecting PII data point of view, yes, yeah.
And I think this really sets the stage to dig a little bit deeper when we talk about cloud native specifically, and that's the role of developers and DevOps teams who are going to be really, on the cutting edge, the forefront of building and deploying cloud native applications, containers, Kubernetes tech stacks, PaaS or serverless architectures. And I'll start with Neil on this one, and then Vivek can share what's happening at an organization like Digital Turbine. But Neil, talk a little bit about how security needs to think differently in recognizing the role developers and DevOps teams play in this world.
And every time I think about this question or this problem, I remember, I come from a world where we used to ship software every 3 years. A lot of organizations used to ship quarterly. Now I remember I was presenting and he was talking about a customer of theirs who ships 70 new container images a day, every day, 7 days a week. So the pace of change has just changed, as accelerated so much that, first of all, from a security perspective, we have to be thinking how we can be as agile, as fast as the development teams. We can't block that. When we're living in a world where we're saying this agility, this ability to ship and fix problems and introduce things fast is a key value proposition for our organizations. As the security team, we can't say, well, stop. We're going to sit, manually go through these things, check line by line to make sure that you meet our checklist of problems. We can't be a barrier in the way that we were before. We have to think about how we meet the business, how we meet DevOps head on. And second, I think somebody told me that there are 15 DevOps engineers for every security engineer. So we're never going to win on manpower. We'll never, even if we had unlimited money, there simply aren't enough security people out there to hire. So I think that the way we approach this now and the way we get ahead of it is a couple of things. First of all, it's automating our security policy in the same way that DevOps has automated testing and deployment and everything else they've done. And really making sure that we have this pipeline where we're testing for security problems along the way in an automated fashion. And then we're meeting developers where we live. We're speaking the same language. We're introducing those issues into the places they're already working, into the pipeline where they're already looking, into the Jira tickets where they're already working, sort of wherever they are, we meet them there. And then I think the third big thing in that for me is really integration between the teams. So traditionally, I think developers and security people have thought of each other as like natural enemies. It just is what is. I don't think we can live in that world anymore. I think we've got to meet each other halfway. We've got to build out environments where we work well together and where we integrate well together. Fundamentally, I don't think developers don't want to be secure. I think it's just a matter of them having other goals and not having easy access to good security information, intelligence, policy. And then I think on the security side, we have not understood sort of the processes and the approaches and how those things are built. So it's a matter of meeting in between.
Yeah, so I think I've had a few run-ins, so to speak, of the situation that you just described. So it's definitely a challenge. Like the concept of DevSecOps and shift left has been around for the last at least 5 years, right? And I've tried this at a couple of firms, and I would say to moderate success. It is not a slam dunk. It is not a technology problem whatsoever, right? It's a people and process problem. Instead of me answering or sharing my experience, what I wanted to check with you, Neil, is like you have worked with a lot more customers than I have actually worked in companies. So what has worked? What has worked for some of these customers that maybe small to medium sized enterprises can adopt and do better?
Yeah, and interestingly, there's a question that Joe Leah asked that ties into that about what specific tools, technologies would you use? And I think it's always people, process, technology. You can't just solve one of those problems. So first of all, I will tell you the most successful implementation I've ever seen was was mandated from the top down. It came from the CISO down that this was the approach that we were going to do. And it really integrated automated security testing directly into source control and pipelines so that they were just happening in the same way that unit testing, integration testing, everything else that they were already doing was. And what was interesting to me about it was it was so fluid that I don't think the developers knew what the underlying technology was. They just knew if they checked something in and they violated a policy, they created a new critical vulnerability, sort of whatever it was, their check-in failed or their build failed, and they had to address it in the same way if they broke a unit test. So the first piece for me was it was built exactly the same way that all of the other technologies that DevOps teams were using were built, and it was right in line where they were already working. That's a critical piece for me. And I think secondarily, there's a question of, from the people perspective, how do you build a more integrated view there? And I think, there's lots of people who talk about lots of things like building champions in the dev teams who own security and evangelize security. One of the simplest things I've heard, a CISO told me that every week, one person on his team spends a day working on Jira tickets with the DevOps team, not security tickets, just generally the work that they're doing so that they have a view of what their processes look like, how things happen, and they have that connection of being part of the process and being involved in it. So I think there's a certain amount of thinking like that, like how do we break down the people barriers between the team? And I think that gets, the larger you go, the harder that gets, because security teams get more and more specialized and more fractured. But I think that's an important area to think about as well.
Yeah, so I think the first point you mentioned, Neil, absolutely resonates with me in terms of how we are approaching this from a DevSecOps point of view. We are integrating our CSPM tool with GitLab Ultimate and Jenkins, and we do want to have a policy-driven, code scanning capability and so on. I wouldn't say we have achieved success or nirvana as yet. There is always this constant pushback around blocking a deployment. Like, we can be in the audit mode, like we can let people know that there are certain things they need to fix, but blocking it is where, we get pushback on that. And it's an evolving journey nonetheless. Definitely a lot of things for the DevOps team and the security team to learn, but the goal is to get to a combined team. Doesn't necessarily have to be under the same leader, but working together as one function and be the true DevSecOps function that we all aim to achieve.
And I appreciate all the insights there on working with developers and DevOps teams and then plugging into the pipeline. And I think this ultimately sets the stage for how third-party analyst firms are trying to qualify all of these requirements, which is one of the main topics of today's program, where Gartner recently published their 2023 market guide for cloud-native applications that looks at, obviously, the state of the market when it comes to how organizations are applying cloud security controls, the requirements that are part of this evolution. We're excited that Orca was included as one of the representative vendors in the latest market guide for CNAPP. And we wanted to let everyone know in the audience that it's available for download. But this is where I'll start with Vivek, and then, certainly Neil can comment. Vivek, what are some of the requirements that you are really aligned to that you think the analyst firms like Gartner are getting right, in the state of the market, or what jumps out to you in the report?
Yeah, so I think, not necessarily a fan of how we go through all this abbreviations and naming changes and so on. But, we got to align a big market on particular terminologies and so on. But as I see my own journey in the cybersecurity world, my thoughts go back to when CSPM, or Cloud Security Posture Management, became a viable alternative back in 2014. and that sort of evolved into cloud workload protection platform around 2018, 2019. But we were solving the cloud native security challenges in some bits and pieces, right? And it is okay if you are a medium to large enterprise, because you have the wherewithal both on the people and process front to go like use specific tools that meet your needs, right? But as a CISO of a small to medium sized firm, the whole concept of having a single glass of paint, whether that's around cloud security, whether that's around vulnerability management, or overall CISO metrics that we are concerned about, is of utmost importance. And CNAP is sort of the right maturity, the right next step on that maturity scale, so to speak. I do, this is a part of the other conversation where like most folks may not agree with me. I do feel we're early in the stage with CNAP, right? And I mentioned some of the other terms as well, like CSPM matured, CWPP matured. Where exactly are we with CNAP is an open question for me. And as someone who can't commit unless budget to a new feature or a new tool, I have to be very careful, like to let the maturity play out enough that there is value for me to bring those features into my firm's ecosystem so we can start deriving value right away. But those are some of the requirements that I would specify from a CISO's point of view around CNAP. But Neil, I would be interested to hear your thoughts, right? Specifically around where you're on the maturity scale with CNAP.
So I think we're definitely we're on the upward curve, right? It is not. We're continuing to see big innovation happen. Orca is continuing to make big innovation. To the point, it's sort of interesting. A lot of my day is spent just catching up on what we've done to make sure I know where we're going and what we're doing. Having said that, I think there are two competing pieces of CNAP. And one is that it makes a ton of sense to bring together, you mentioned some of the things, right? CSPM, what have I configured in the cloud, or what have my users configured in the cloud? Is it well configured? Does it meet my policy? And then workload protection, what am I deploying in VMs and containers, and how are they vulnerable and how are they misconfigured? And we've mentioned some other ones, right? Like data is a big one. Identity is a big one. Identity is such a complex issue in the cloud. Like it's complex on-prem. And then we move into the cloud, and instead of a handful of permissions, you've got like 700 different permissions you can assign to a particular user, and it explodes outward. And then API endpoints and sort of all of these things. I think it makes a lot of sense to bring this together into one unified platform where you can start looking at risk across these things. And that's the big thing for CNAP for me is we're taking a lot of disparate things that all affect our cloud security and bringing them into a single platform so we can make better decisions, get better visibility. So I said two competing things. That's one thing for me, is that integration of all of that stuff. But the other competing thing is that it has to fit well into the enterprise. So no matter how inclusive it is, no matter how much we jam into the definition of a CNAP, at the end of the day, there's a bigger business out there. We talked a little bit about DevSecOps and shift left. We've got to integrate with that, right? We've got to get things in front of developers where they're already working. We've got to integrate with ticketing and event and incident management. And how are we in the enterprise dealing with everything that's coming through our security teams and operations teams? We've got to integrate with SIMs and sort of data stores. How are we monitoring things? We've got to integrate with data lakes as we move into that world. We've got to integrate with automation. We've got to integrate with messaging and message ops. So the two competing things for me are, first of all, how much of what's in the cloud can I bring together from a security perspective, integrate, and show you where the risk really is, show you where the threats really are. And then how well can I integrate into your existing operations to take that intelligence that we're generating and put it in front of the right people at the right time?
Yeah, so I think that visibility into the threat path, the end-to-end, is critical. Keith, if there is time for one more question that I can potentially ask Neil. So,
of course, let's do it.
Yeah, so Neil, before I got into cybersecurity, my initiation into technology was through data, right? And all the things that we do, whether it's CSPM, CWPP, or now CNAP, it's predicated on the fact that we have the right amount of data that is clean enough and comes from one single source of truth and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And as I've gone through the maturity scale on the other two terminologies or technologies, I've realized that there is a lot of pre-work to be done for me to gain the best out of these features coming. In your own experience, for us to get, like for a firm like DT to get CNAP right, what sort of data collection, storage, or projections would you say we should be ready with before we even start considering CNAP as a viable alternative for us?
That's a deep question. I think that ultimately I would look at this as a journey. And so what I mean by that is I don't have to. A CNAP like Orca has a lot of features, right? We cover a lot of ground. But day one, I don't have to consume and implement all of those things. So, at the starting phase, I think, first of all, understanding sort of generally what cloud commitment you have, where are the cloud accounts, the organizations, what are those things, and having visibility into that. Now, in a perfect world, you're in a greenfield state where, as a security team, you're planning ahead of time, and this is all future. You're not there yet. That rarely happens. Usually, you're already there, and now you're trying to catch up from a security standpoint. So I think for me, the entry point is knowing that I have cloud stuff, not knowing what's there. And where a CNAP gets you is you can deploy, and I'm going to use Orca as an example. I can deploy Orca today. If I know what cloud accounts I have, what cloud organizations I have, and I have access to them, I can deploy Orca and start getting visibility. And then I can use that as the jumping off point to building the rest of this, right? So once I've got that visibility, I understand that I have a ton of stuff deployed. We have some critical vulnerabilities, sort of all of those things. From there, I can then start figuring out what my next steps are in building that. And once again, if it's a greenfield environment, that's a different sort of conversation. You can plan all of this stuff ahead of time and build out best practice all the way. But I don't think that's reasonable for most orgs. I think most orgs are going to have to, I don't know, somebody the other day used the analogy about how do you eat a whale? You do it a bite at a time. I think for a lot of organizations, cloud security has to be that way. We have to start with, we're behind, we need to catch up. Let's gain visibility, and now let's figure out step 2, step 3, step 4. And it's one of the failings I find in security people almost universally, myself included, is that we tend to look at any particular solution and say, well, that's not complete. What if I do this? What if I do that? And discount solutions because I don't have the complete thing. But everything is defense in depth. So as long as I'm building on it, I feel good about it, right? I feel good about jumping in, deploying, getting visibility, realizing how bad my problems are, prioritizing those, building the next step, building the next step, building the next step, and continuing to chip away at getting to a more keplete security solution.
Yeah, in terms of having a complete inventory, just sidestepping a little bit, like we actually rely on Orca quite a bit for that. With the agentless scanning that Orca provides, it sort of actually acts as an inventory management system for us. Like there have been instances where we have realized, looking at our VMs that Orca scans, that some of the policies that we had put in place has actually not worked, and somebody has spun up something that they should have not, et cetera, right? So just an anecdote in terms of knowing what's running before we get into the whole CNAP world, and where Orca is helping us with that.
And I just want to say, I think that's a great, kind of stopping point, although I know that this conversation could continue for quite a while. I want to say a huge thank you to Vivek for fitting us into his busy schedule, and Neil for joining us from the Orca Security side. If you'd like to learn more about Vivek's impact and Digital Turbine's journey in the cloud and security, I invite you to read the case study that they worked on with the team here at Orca, because I think it could be a great takeaway from what we talked about today. And as a reminder, if you'd like to learn more about CNAP, you can download the Gartner Market Guide for Cloud Native Application Protection Platforms. Thank you so much again to our speakers today, and I wish you all a great rest of the day. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.